Emma Henderson Walsh froze mid-eulogy, her trembling voice dying as 73 mourners gasped in unison. Through the wrought-iron gates of Sunset Memorial Cemetery, a 450-pound African lion padded silently across the Texas grass, his golden mane catching the November sunlight like a crown of fire. This wasn't supposed to happen. King belonged 12 miles away, locked safely in his sanctuary enclosure. Mrs. Patterson from the church choir stumbled backward, her folding chair clattering against granite headstones. Children pressed against their parents' legs while grown men reached instinctively for car keys they'd left in distant vehicles. The funeral director's clipboard hit the ground with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the stunned silence. Emma stared at the approaching lion, remembering her father's weathered hands feeding King scraps of meat just 6 months ago, back when Frank Henderson was alive to explain impossible things. Now King carried something metallic in his massive jaws, something that glinted like her father's buried military dog tags. "Nobody move," Dr. Maggie O'Connor whispered through clenched teeth, her veterinary training warring against maternal instinct. "Just don't move." But how had King escaped? And why now, at this moment when Emma needed answers, her father would never give? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Frank Henderson had been feeding King his morning portion of raw beef when the first signs of trouble appeared. The 78-year-old man moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had begun betraying him, though his weathered hands remained steady as he tossed chunks of meat through the reinforced fence of the Golden Sunset Wildlife Sanctuary. "There you go, big fella," Frank murmured in his gravelly Texas drawl, watching the magnificent lion tear into his breakfast. "You're looking mighty fine this morning." King responded with a low rumble of contentment, a sound that had become as familiar to Frank as his own heartbeat over the past 8 years. The sanctuary sprawled across 847 acres of Texas hill country, 45 minutes northwest of Austin, where the rolling hills met endless blue sky. To visitors, it appeared to be a modest wildlife preserve housing 23 African lions and various other rescued animals. What they didn't know was that Frank Henderson, who lived in a modest mobile home on the property and drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, was the sanctuary's secret owner and benefactor. Frank had purchased the land with money earned from decades of careful investments and a modest inheritance from his late wife, Sarah. At least that's what he told anyone who asked. The truth was far more complicated, buried in offshore accounts and shell corporations that even his daughter Emma knew nothing about. Emma Henderson Walsh lived in San Francisco, where she worked 80-hour weeks as a senior partner at Morris & Klein Associates, one of California's most prestigious law firms. At 45, she had built a reputation as a fierce litigator who could dissect corporate contracts with surgical precision. She lived in a Pacific Heights townhouse worth $3.2 million, drove a BMW, and hadn't visited her father in Texas for over 18 months. The last conversation between father and daughter had been brief and strained. Emma had called while rushing between depositions, her voice tight with professional stress. "Dad, I can't talk long. The kids have soccer practice, and I've got a client dinner tonight." Frank had wanted to tell her about King's latest antics, about how the lion had somehow learned to recognize the sound of his truck and would wait by the gate each morning. Instead, he'd simply said, "You take care of yourself, Emmalou. Don't work too hard." "I always do, Dad. You know that." The lion had gone dead before Frank could say he loved her. Dr. Margaret O'Connor served as the sanctuary's head veterinarian, a 52-year-old widow who had fled to Texas 8 years ago after losing her husband and teenage son in a car accident outside Chicago. She found purpose in healing animals that couldn't heal themselves, and if she harbored feelings for the kind old man who'd given her sanctuary along with the animals, she kept those emotions carefully locked away. Frank trusted Maggie with the animals' lives, but he'd never told her about the fortune he'd accumulated or about the real reason he'd dedicated his life to saving lions. Memorial Day weekend arrived with the oppressive heat that Texas summers delivered like a warning. Frank Henderson rose at 5:30 in the morning, as he had every day for the past 15 years, and shuffled to his small kitchen to brew coffee in a pot older than most of his lions. The mobile home creaked around him, a modest dwelling that had served as his sanctuary within the sanctuary. Through his window he could see King pacing restlessly in the early dawn light. Something was wrong. In 8 years of caring for the magnificent lion, Frank had never seen King refuse his morning meal, but today the animal had turned away from his food with an agitation that set Frank's nerves on edge. "What's got you all worked up, big fella?" Frank muttered, pulling on his worn work boots. At 78, his joints protested every movement, but he'd learned to ignore the complaints his body made. The Korean War had taught him that pain was just another sensation to push through. He stepped outside into air that already shimmered with heat, despite the early hour. King immediately approached the fence, pressing his massive head against the chain link with an urgency Frank had never witnessed. The lion's golden eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved visitors, but Frank had long ago accepted that King understood more than most people gave him credit for. "Easy now," Frank soothed, reaching through the fence to scratch behind King's ears. "Tell old Frank what's bothering you." King pulled away and trotted toward the main watering hole, looking back over his shoulder as if expecting Frank to follow. The other lions remained in their shaded areas, avoiding the climbing sun, but King's behavior was drawing their attention. Frank followed, his weathered hands gripping the fence as he walked. When he reached the water source, his stomach dropped. Dead fish floated on the surface, their silver bodies catching the morning light like scattered coins. The water itself had an oily sheen that spoke of contamination. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. Someone had poisoned the water supply. Every animal in the sanctuary was at risk, and with Dr. Maggie in Austin picking up medical supplies, Frank was alone with 23 lions and a dozen other animals that would be dead within hours if he didn't act. His cell phone felt heavy in his arthritic hands as he scrolled through his contacts. He could call the authorities, but they'd take at least 6 hours to respond properly, and by then it would be too late. He could try to evacuate the animals, but that would require equipment and manpower he didn't have. The only option was the experimental antidote he'd helped develop with veterinary researchers at Texas A&M, stored in the medical facility's refrigerator. The problem was that the antidote had never been tested on humans, and at his age, with his heart condition, taking it could kill him. But if he didn't test it on himself first, he couldn't ethically give it to the animals he'd sworn to protect. Frank's hands shook as he prepared the injection. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent 50 years trying to atone for taking one life might die trying to save 23 more. He'd never told anyone about what happened in Korea, not even Sarah during their 42 years of marriage. The secret had eaten at him like cancer, driving him to dedicate his fortune and his life to preserving what he'd once destroyed. The antidote burned as it entered his bloodstream, and Frank gritted his teeth against the sensation. He had maybe an hour before his body would react badly, if it was going to react at all. Moving with desperate efficiency, he began preparing doses for each animal, starting with King. His phone rang as he drew the 10th syringe. Emma's name appeared on the cracked screen and Frank's heart clenched. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in 3 weeks, not since their last stilted conversation about her work and his hobby. "Dad, I can't talk long." Emma's voice carried the familiar strain of someone perpetually running late. Jake has baseball practice and Sophie has piano lessons. I'm already behind schedule." Frank paused in his work, the weight of everything he'd never said to his daughter pressing against his chest. "Emmalou, I need to tell you something important. Can it wait? I'm stuck in traffic, and if I'm late picking up the kids, David will use it against me in the custody hearing. You know how he is." Frank looked at King, who had somehow understood the danger and was keeping the other lions away from the contaminated water. His daughter's voice faded into background noise as he realized this might be their last conversation. "Dad. Are you there?" "Sure, sweetheart," Frank managed, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "You take care of those babies. Tell them their grandfather loves them." "I will. Look, I really have to go. We'll talk soon, okay?" The line went dead before Frank could say he loved her too. Frank Henderson collapsed beside the water treatment facility at 2:17 in the afternoon, his weathered body finally succumbing to the experimental antidote coursing through his veins. He had managed to administer the life-saving medication to 19 of the 23 lions, his arthritic hands moving with desperate precision even as his heart began to race erratically. King found him first, the massive lion's roar echoing across the sanctuary with a sound Frank had never heard before. Pure, anguished grief. Dr. Maggie O'Connor's pickup truck kicked up a cloud of Texas dust as she raced through the sanctuary gates, her veterinary supplies forgotten in the truck bed. She'd received Frank's garbled radio message 40 minutes ago. "Water poisoned. Gave them antidote. King knows." The transmission had cut to static, and her repeated attempts to reach him had met only silence. The scene that greeted her defied comprehension. Frank lay unconscious in the dirt, his face ashen and his breathing shallow, while King stood guard over his still form. The other lions had gathered in an unprecedented formation, creating a protective circle around the man who had been their caretaker for 8 years. None of them approached the contaminated water source, as if King had somehow communicated the danger. "Frank!" Maggie dropped to her knees beside him, her medical training overriding the emotional tsunami threatening to overwhelm her. His pulse was thread and irregular, his skin clammy with perspiration. Empty antidote vials lay scattered around him like fallen soldiers, evidence of his desperate mission to save every animal under his care. The helicopter from Austin General Hospital arrived within 23 minutes of Maggie's emergency call, its rotors whipping the Texas heat into a frenzy. As the paramedics loaded Frank onto the stretcher, King released another earth-shaking roar that seemed to vibrate through Maggie's bones. The lion's golden eyes never left Frank's motionless form. And when the helicopter lifted off, King began pacing the fence line with an agitation that worried Maggie more than she cared to admit. 3,000 miles away in San Francisco, Emma Henderson Walsh sat in the 42nd floor conference room of Morrison Klein Associates, reviewing contracts for the Yamamoto acquisition. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly for the past hour, but the caller ID showed only Austin General Hospital. Probably some billing issue related to her father's occasional medical checkups. She'd deal with it after the meeting. "Emma, we need your signature on page 47, her partner David Morrison was saying when her phone rang for the 15th time. This time, she glanced at the screen and saw Dr. Margaret O'Connor's name. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," Emma said, stepping away from the conference table. "This is Emma Henderson Walsh. Emma, thank God, it's Dr. O'Connor from your father's sanctuary. You need to get to Austin immediately. Frank's in critical condition at Austin General Hospital." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. The conference room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay, suddenly felt impossibly far from the Texas Hill Country where her father had chosen to spend his golden years, surrounded by lions instead of family. "What happened? Is he going to be okay?" Emma's voice cracked, drawing concerned glances from her colleagues. "Someone poisoned the water supply at the sanctuary." Your father took an experimental antidote to test it before giving it to the animals. His heart couldn't handle it. Emma, you need to know. The doctors are saying it's touch and go. His next 72 hours are critical. Emma stared out at the bay, where sailboats moved like white triangles against the blue water. 48 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether she could close the Yamamoto deal before her ex-husband's lawyers filed another motion in their custody battle. Now her father was dying, and she was 3,000 miles away, arguing about contract language that suddenly seemed meaningless. "I'll be on the next flight," Emma said, her lawyer's mind already calculating logistics. "Dr. O'Connor, what about the animals? Are they safe?" "Your father saved them all. Every single one. He risked his life to make sure they wouldn't suffer." Maggie's voice broke slightly. "King hasn't eaten since it happened. He just stands at the gate, looking toward Austin like he's waiting for Frank to come home." Emma closed her eyes, remembering the last conversation she'd had with her father. She'd been rushing, as always, too busy to really listen to what he'd been trying to tell her. "Something important," he'd said, and she'd brushed him off because Jake had baseball practice and Sophie had piano lessons, and her life in San Francisco was too complicated to make room for whatever her father wanted to share. "I'll call you when I land in Austin," Emma managed, ending the call before the emotion in her voice could escape completely. She returned to the conference room where 12 lawyers sat around the polished table, their faces expectant. The Yamamoto deal represented 18 months of work and a potential partnership track for Emma's career. Walking away now would mean starting over, rebuilding relationships, proving herself all over again. "I have to go," Emma announced, gathering her papers with hands that trembled slightly. "Family emergency." David Morrison frowned. "Emma, we're so close to closing this deal." "Can't it wait 24 hours? Emma looked at him, this man she'd worked alongside for 7 years, who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. "My father is dying," she said quietly. "So no, David, it can't wait." As her taxi raced toward San Francisco International Airport, Emma stared at her phone, scrolling through 6 months of missed calls from Dad that she'd been too busy to return. Emma's flight from San Francisco touched down at Austin Bergstrom International Airport at 11:47 p.m., nearly 12 hours after Dr. O'Connor's devastating phone call. She'd spent the 5-hour flight staring out the window at the darkness below, her laptop closed for the first time in months, thinking about all the conversations she'd never had with her father. The rental car smelled like industrial air freshener and other people's lives, and Emma drove through the empty Texas highways with her GPS announcing turns in a cheerful voice that seemed obscene given the circumstances. Austin General Hospital's ICU occupied the entire 7th floor, a maze of beeping machines and hushed conversations that reminded Emma why she'd always hated hospitals. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly pallor, and the smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of human suffering. Frank Henderson lay in room 714, surrounded by more tubes and wires than Emma had thought possible for one human body to accommodate. "You must be Emma," said a tired-looking nurse who couldn't have been older than 25. "Your father's been asking for you. Well, when he's conscious, anyway." Emma approached the bed slowly, shocked by how small her father looked amid all the medical equipment. Frank Henderson had always seemed larger than life to her. The stern Korean War veteran who'd raised her with military precision after her mother died when Emma was 16. Now he looked fragile, his weathered face pale against the white hospital pillow, his breathing assisted by a machine that hissed softly with each artificial breath. "Dad?" Emma whispered, taking his hand in hers. His skin felt papery and cold, nothing like the strong hands that had taught her to throw a baseball and change a tire. "I'm here." "I'm finally here." Frank's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on his daughter's face. When recognition dawned, a tear slipped down his cheek. "Emma Lou," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the machines. "You came." "Of course I came, Dad. I'm sorry it took so long. The flights were all booked and I had to—" "Doesn't matter," Frank interrupted, squeezing her hand with what little strength he had left. "You're here now. That's what matters." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Frank's cardiologist, appeared in the doorway with a chart in her hands and exhaustion written across her face. She was a woman in her 50s who'd clearly been working too many consecutive hours, but her eyes held the kind of compassion that came from genuinely caring about her patients. "Miss Henderson Walsh, I'm Dr. Mitchell. I've been overseeing your father's care since he arrived. We need to discuss his condition." Emma followed the doctor into the hallway, leaving Frank to rest. The conversation that followed would haunt Emma for the rest of her life. The experimental antidote had saved the animals but was slowly destroying Frank's organs. His kidneys were failing, his liver was shutting down, and his heart was working at 30% capacity. "How long?" Emma asked, the lawyer in her needing concrete facts, even as the daughter in her recoiled from the answer. "With aggressive treatment, maybe 2 weeks. Without it, days." "I'm sorry, Ms. Henderson Walsh. Your father is a remarkable man. What he did to save those animals took incredible courage. But his body can't recover from this kind of damage at his age." Emma spent the next 3 days living in the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside Frank's bed, and eating terrible cafeteria food that tasted like cardboard. She called her law firm to request indefinite leave, ignoring David Morrison's increasingly frantic voicemails about the Yamamoto deal. Her ex-husband threatened to use her absence against her in their custody battle, but for the first time in years, Emma didn't care about the legal maneuvering that had consumed her life. During Frank's lucid moments, father and daughter had the conversations they should have had years ago. Frank told her about the Korean War, about the friends he'd lost, and the nightmares that still woke him some nights. He spoke about her mother Sarah, about how proud he'd been of Emma's achievements, even if he'd never known how to express it properly. "I was never good with words, Emma Lou," Frank admitted during one of their late-night talks. "Your mother, she was the one who knew how to say the important things. After she died, I figured the best way to show I loved you was to make you strong enough to survive anything. Maybe I went too far with that." "You did what you thought was right, Dad. I understand that now." "Do you?" "Because I spent your whole childhood teaching you to be tough instead of teaching you to be happy. I see you now, working 80 hours a week, fighting with your ex-husband, stressed about money and custody and keeping up appearances. That's not the life I wanted for you." Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Dad, I'm successful. I'm a partner at one of the best firms in California. I own a $3 million house. I drive a BMW. Isn't that what you wanted for me?" Frank managed a weak smile. "Sweetheart, I wanted you to be happy. All that other stuff is just noise." He paused, gathering strength. "You know what makes me happy. Watching King chase butterflies in the morning sun. Seeing him trust humans again after what he went through as a cub. Simple things, Emma Lou, simple things." On the 4th day, Dr. O'Connor arrived with devastating news about the sanctuary. King had stopped eating entirely and was showing signs of severe depression. The other lions were following his lead, and 3 of them were refusing food as well. Without Frank's presence, the delicate ecosystem of the sanctuary was beginning to collapse. "I've never seen anything like it," Maggie told Emma as they stood in the hospital corridor. "King somehow knows how sick Frank is. He positions himself at the gate every morning at exactly the time Frank used to arrive for work. He stays there all day, and at night he paces the fence line. The other animals are picking up on his distress." Emma felt a surge of panic. What happens if King dies? What happens to all of them? I don't know, Maggie admitted. Frank was the heart of that place. Without him, I'm not sure it can survive. That evening, Emma sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand and trying to find the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. Dad, what's going to happen to the sanctuary when you're gone? What's going to happen to King? Frank's eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in days. That's up to you, Emma Lou. Me? Dad, I don't know anything about running a wildlife sanctuary. I'm a corporate lawyer. I live in San Francisco. I have kids and a career and a custody battle to fight. And King has spent 8 years learning to trust humans again after being abandoned as a cub. You think he's going to understand why the only family he's ever known just disappears? The weight of responsibility settled on Emma's shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd spent her entire adult life building a carefully constructed existence in San Francisco, complete with private schools for her children, a prestigious job, and a social circle that valued achievement above all else. The idea of walking away from that life to run a wildlife sanctuary in Texas seemed impossible. But as she looked at her father, really looked at him, she began to understand what he'd been trying to tell her all those years. Success wasn't about the size of your house or the prestige of your job title. It was about the connections you made, the lives you touched, the legacy you left behind. Tell me about King, Emma said quietly. Tell me how you two met. Frank's face lit up with the first genuine smile Emma had seen since arriving in Austin. He was just 6 months old when we found him, caught in a poacher's trap with his mother dead beside him, half-starved, infected wounds, afraid of every human who came near him. Took me 3 months just to get him to eat from my hand. Why didn't you just send him to a zoo? Because zoos are prisons, Emma Lou, even the good ones. King deserved better than that. He deserved to remember what it felt like to be wild, even if he could never be truly free again. Frank squeezed Emma's hand with surprising strength. That sanctuary isn't just a business, sweetheart. It's a promise to every animal there that they'll never be abandoned again, never be forgotten, never be treated as less than the magnificent creatures they are. Emma stared out the hospital window at the Austin skyline, lights twinkling in the darkness like earthbound stars. Somewhere 45 minutes away, King was pacing his enclosure, waiting for a man who might never come home. What if I can't do it, Dad? What if I fail them? Then you'll figure it out and try again. That's what Henderson women do. We don't give up, and we don't let our family down. Frank's voice was growing weaker, but his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. King isn't just a lion, Emma Lou. He's your brother now, and you don't abandon family. That night, Emma called her children in San Francisco. Jake, 12 years old and obsessed with baseball statistics, listened quietly as his mother tried to explain why she might need to stay in Texas longer than planned. Sophie, 10 years old and wise beyond her years, asked the question that cut straight to Emma's heart. Mommy, is Grandpa Frank going to die? Emma closed her eyes, remembering her own father's unwavering honesty when she'd asked similar questions about her mother's cancer. I think so, sweetheart, but he's not afraid and he wants us to take care of his lions when he's gone. The ones with the big manes? Yes, especially King. He's Grandpa Frank's best friend. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Mom, if Grandpa Frank loves those lions like family, then they're kind of our family too, right? Out of the mouths of babes, Emma thought. You're absolutely right, Sophie. They are our family. The crisis reached its peak on Frank's 8th day in the hospital when his heart monitor began screaming at 3:17 in the morning. Emma jerked awake in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, instantly alert as a team of medical professionals rushed into the room with equipment and urgent voices. Dr. Mitchell worked over Frank's still form with practiced efficiency. her hands moving in patterns Emma couldn't understand but recognized as a desperate fight for life. "We're losing him," one of the nurses said, her voice tight with professional concern. "Blood pressure's dropping fast." Emma pressed herself against the wall, watching helplessly as strangers worked to save the man who had raised her with military precision and awkward love. The machines around Frank's bed painted electronic pictures of a body in failure, and Emma found herself praying to a God she hadn't spoken to since her mother's funeral 29 years ago. After 47 minutes, that felt like hours. "Doctor." Mitchell stepped back from the bed, pulling off her latex gloves with the weary expression of someone who'd fought this battle too many times. "We've stabilized him for now, but his organs are shutting down faster than we anticipated. I'm sorry, Ms. Henderson Walsh, but you need to prepare yourself. Your father may not survive another episode like this." Emma nodded, unable to trust her voice, and returned to her vigil beside Frank's bed. His breathing was more labored now, each rise and fall of his chest requiring visible effort. She took his hand in hers, surprised by how cold his skin had become, and began to talk to him the way she should have talked to him years ago. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said about the sanctuary, about King. I know you think I should stay in Texas and take care of them, but I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. I've spent my whole life in conference rooms and courtrooms, arguing about contracts and depositions." "What do I know about lions?" Frank's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his daughter's face with enormous effort. "Emma Lou," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the machines. "Come closer." Emma leaned in until her ear was nearly touching his lips. "What is it, Dad?" "I need to tell you something. About King. About why I really started the sanctuary." Frank paused, gathering what little strength he had left. "Korea, 1952. I killed a lioness. Pregnant lioness. Military orders, but that doesn't make it right. Been trying to make amends ever since." Emma pulled back to look at her father's face, seeing the pain that had nothing to do with his failing organs. "Dad, that was 70 years ago. You were a soldier following orders. Doesn't matter. I took a life that wasn't mine to take. Every lion I've saved since then has been an apology to that mother I couldn't save." Frank's grip on Emma's hand tightened with surprising strength. "King's different, though. He's special. When I found him in that trap, it was like the universe giving me one last chance to get it right." Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes. "What are you asking me to do, Dad?" "I'm asking you to love him the way I couldn't love you when you were growing up. I'm asking you to give him the family I was too scared to be for you." Before Emma could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. O'Connor. "King collapsed an hour ago. Won't eat, won't drink. Vet from AM says maybe 48 hours if this continues. Emma, I think he knows." Emma showed the message to her father, watching his face crumble with an emotion she'd rarely seen from the stoic man who'd raised her. "He's dying too, isn't he?" Frank whispered. "He's dying because I'm dying. Dr. O'Connor says it's not unusual for animals to mourn when their caretakers are sick. She thinks if you could come home even for a few hours." "I can't leave this bed, Emma Lou." "You know that." Frank's voice carried the weight of defeat. "But you can go to him. You can let him know he's not abandoned." Emma stared at her father, understanding finally dawning. "You want me to leave you here, while you're dying? I want you to save him while there's still time. I want you to show him that Henderson love doesn't end with death, it just changes forms." Frank's eyes were pleading now, stripped of the stern authority Emma remembered from her childhood. "Please, sweetheart, don't let him die thinking he's alone." Against every instinct screaming in her head, Emma kissed her father's forehead and walked out of Austin General Hospital at 5:43 in the morning. The drive to the sanctuary took 47 minutes through empty Texas highways, and Emma spent every mile second-guessing her decision to leave her dying father's bedside for an animal she'd met exactly twice in her adult life. The sanctuary looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, more wild and primitive than Emma remembered. Dr. O'Connor met her at the gate with red-rimmed eyes and coffee that had been brewing too long. "He's in the medical facility," Maggie said without preamble. "I sedated him lightly so we could get some fluids into him, but Emma, he's in bad shape. I've never seen an animal grieve like this." King lay on his side in the sanctuary's medical facility, his magnificent mane dulled and his breathing shallow. At 450 pounds, he still dominated the space, but Emma could see the toll that 8 days of refusing food had taken on his massive frame. His ribs were beginning to show, and his eyes held a vacancy that broke Emma's heart. "Can he hear me?" Emma asked, kneeling beside the lion who had somehow become central to her father's life. "I think so. Lions are more emotionally intelligent than most people realize. They form deep attachments, and they understand loss in ways that surprise us." Emma reached out tentatively and placed her hand on King's flank, feeling the rise and fall of his labored breathing. "Hey there, big guy. I'm Emma, Frank's daughter. Dad wanted me to come see you." King's eyes opened at the sound of her voice, golden orbs that seemed to look directly into Emma's soul. There was intelligence there, and pain, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "He's very sick, King. Dad is very sick, and he can't come home right now. But he wanted me to tell you that he loves you. He wanted me to tell you that you're not abandoned." As if responding to her words, King lifted his massive head and rested it against Emma's leg. The gesture was so trusting, so vulnerable that Emma began to cry for the first time since arriving in Texas. Here was an apex predator, a creature capable of killing her without effort, seeking comfort from a stranger because that stranger carried the scent of the man he loved. "I don't know what I'm doing," Emma whispered to King, scratching behind his ears the way she'd seen her father do countless times. "I'm a lawyer from San Francisco. I drive a BMW and live in a $3 million house and argue about contracts for a living. I don't know anything about taking care of lions." King's response was a low rumble that Emma felt more than heard, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones and settle somewhere near her heart. For the first time since arriving in Texas, Emma understood what her father had been trying to tell her about simple happiness, about the connections that mattered more than money or status or career advancement. Her phone rang at 7:23 a.m. Dr. Mitchell's name appeared on the screen, and Emma's heart stopped. "Ms. Henderson Walsh, you need to get back here immediately. Your father is asking for you, and his condition has deteriorated significantly." Emma looked down at King, who was watching her with those intelligent golden eyes. "I have to go back to the hospital," she told him. "But I'm going to come back, okay? I promise I'm going to come back." King seemed to understand. He allowed Emma to stand, then struggled to his feet as well, swaying slightly from weakness but determined to see her to the gate. Other lions had gathered during Emma's visit, forming a loose circle around the medical facility as if they too understood the gravity of the moment. As Emma drove back toward Austin, she caught sight of King in her rearview mirror, standing at the sanctuary gate in the exact spot where he'd waited for Frank every morning for 8 years. But this time, instead of waiting for someone to arrive, he was watching someone leave. And Emma realized that the weight of responsibility she'd been carrying had just doubled. Her father was dying, and now she was responsible for 23 lions who didn't understand why their world was falling apart. Emma arrived at Austin General Hospital to find her father in a state she'd never seen before, fully conscious and unnaturally alert, as if death had given him a temporary reprieve to handle unfinished business. Dr. Mitchell explained that this often happened in the final stages. a phenomenon called terminal lucidity that allowed dying patients a few hours of clarity before the end. "Dad, I went to see King," Emma said, taking his hand as she settled into the familiar chair beside his bed. "He's not doing well, but he seemed to understand when I told him you love him." Frank's eyes brightened with something between relief and profound sadness. "Thank you, Emma Lou. That means more to me than you'll ever know." He paused, studying his daughter's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "But there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Emma felt her stomach clench with anticipation. Over the past week, her father had revealed layer after layer of secrets: the experimental antidote, the Korean War trauma, his deep connection to King. What else could there be? "The sanctuary isn't what you think it is," Frank began, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I didn't just buy that land with your mother's life insurance money and my army pension. Emma, I've been lying to you about our financial situation for 20 years. Emma's lawyer instincts kicked in, her mind immediately cataloging the implications of whatever revelation was coming. "What do you mean, Dad?" Frank gestured weakly toward the small closet where Emma had hung his clothes. "In my jacket pocket there's a key. It opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank on Congress Avenue, box number 1247. Emma retrieved the key, a small brass object that felt surprisingly heavy in her palm. "What's in the box, Dad?" "The truth about who I really am." "About what I've been doing all these years." Frank's breathing was becoming more labored, but his words remained clear. "Emma, I'm worth $847 million. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She stared at her father, lying in his hospital bed wearing a faded cotton gown, the same man who'd driven a 15-year-old pickup truck and lived in a mobile home and complained about the cost of groceries. "That's impossible, Dad. You live on Social Security. You shop at thrift stores. You eat beans and rice half the week." "Because every dollar I didn't spend on myself could go towards saving animals. I own 47 wildlife sanctuaries worldwide, Emma. Golden Sunset is just the one I live at." Frank's voice carried a note of pride mixed with exhaustion. "Your mother's life insurance was $25,000. Everything else came from investments, real estate, and business ventures I never told you about." Emma felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "Why? Why would you lie about something like this?" "Because I watched money destroy your mother's family. Her father was a millionaire who measured love in dollar signs and inheritance clauses. I swore I'd never let wealth become a wedge between us." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I could give you." "Dad, I thought you were struggling financially. I've been sending you money every month for 3 years. Money I could barely afford because of the custody battle and the divorce lawyers." Frank's face crumpled with shame. "I put every penny you sent into a trust fund for Jake and Sophie. It's earning interest. They'll get it all back when they turn 18, plus about 40% more." Emma stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, her mind reeling. $847 million. Dad, do you understand what this means? Do you understand how this changes everything?" "It doesn't change anything that matters," Frank said firmly. "Money is just a tool, Emma Lou. I used it to build something meaningful. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Before Emma could respond, Dr. Mitchell entered the room with a grim expression. "Mr. Henderson, I'm afraid we need to discuss your options. Your kidneys have stopped functioning entirely, and your heart is working at less than 20% capacity. We can continue aggressive treatment, but I have to be honest, it will only prolong your suffering without offering any realistic hope of recovery." Emma felt the room spinning around her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father has hours, not days. You need to decide whether you want us to continue life support or make him comfortable in his final time. Frank squeezed Emma's hand with surprising strength. "I want to go home, Emma Lou. I want to see King one more time." Dr. Mitchell shook her head immediately. "Mr. Henderson, I can't recommend that. Moving you in your condition could accelerate—" "Doctor," Frank interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made life-and-death decisions before, "I'm dying either way. I'd rather die looking at something beautiful I helped create than staring at these hospital walls." Emma found herself caught between her father's wishes and medical advice that made logical sense. But as she looked at Frank, really looked at him, she saw not just her dying father, but a man who'd spent 78 years making difficult choices with quiet dignity. "What do you need to make this happen?" Emma asked Dr. Mitchell. 2 hours later, an ambulance was transporting Frank Henderson back to Golden Sunset Wildlife Sanctuary for the last time. Emma rode beside him, holding his hand and watching the Texas landscape roll past the windows. Frank had insisted on being conscious for the journey, refusing pain medication that might cloud his final moments. "Tell me about the other sanctuaries," Emma said as they passed through the familiar gates of the property that had been her father's secret kingdom. "There's one in Kenya, right on the border of Masai Mara. Another in South Africa, near Kruger National Park. We've got facilities in Cambodia, Indonesia, Brazil, anywhere animals need protection from poachers and habitat destruction." Frank's voice was weak but animated. "Each one employs local people, works with government wildlife agencies, focuses on rehabilitation and release when possible." Emma shook her head in amazement. "Dad, you've been running a global conservation empire, and I thought you were just a lonely old man with a hobby." "I am a lonely old man with a hobby. The hobby just got bigger than I expected." They transferred Frank to a hospital bed that had been set up in the sanctuary's main observation area, where he could see King and the other lions through the large windows. The moment the ambulance doors opened, King appeared at the fence, moving faster than he had in over a week. The other lions followed, creating an unprecedented gathering that Dr. O'Connor had never witnessed in her 8 years at the facility. "They know," Frank whispered as Emma helped adjust his pillows. "Somehow, they know I'm home." King pressed his massive body against the fence, his golden eyes locked on Frank's face through the window. The lion's mouth opened, and he released a sound Emma had never heard before. Not quite a roar, more like a song of greeting mixed with mourning. "He's saying hello," Frank translated, tears streaming down his cheeks. "And goodbye." As the sun set over the Texas hill country, Frank Henderson lay surrounded by the animals he'd spent the last 20 years of his life protecting. Emma sat beside him, finally understanding that her father's love had never been absent. It had simply been expressed in a language she'd never learned to speak. "Emma Lou," Frank whispered as the last light faded from the sky. "Promise me something." "Anything, Dad." "Promise me you'll teach Jake and Sophie that money is just paper unless you use it to make the world better. Promise me you'll show them what I couldn't show you, that love isn't something you save for special occasions. It's something you give away every single day." Emma squeezed her father's hand, feeling the weight of $847 million and 23 lions, and a legacy she'd never asked for, but suddenly couldn't imagine abandoning. "I promise, Dad." "We'll take care of them all." Frank Henderson died at 3:17 a.m. on June 25, 2023, 71 years to the minute after he'd killed a lioness in Korea and began a lifetime of atonement. Emma Henderson Walsh stood in the law offices of Hartwell Martinez Associates 3 days after her father's death, staring at documents that revealed the true scope of Frank Henderson's secret empire. The conference room overlooked downtown Austin, but Emma's attention was focused entirely on the papers spread across the mahogany table. Incorporation documents, property deeds, financial statements, and trust agreements that painted a picture of a man she'd never really known. "Your father was remarkably thorough," said Patricia Martinez, the estate attorney who'd been managing Frank's affairs for 15 years. He established the Henderson Foundation in 2008, with assets currently valued at $847 million. You are the sole beneficiary, but there are conditions. Emma picked up a leather-bound folder marked Emma's Instructions in her father's careful handwriting. Inside, she found a letter dated just 3 months earlier, written in the same precise script she remembered from childhood homework corrections. "My dear Emma Lou," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I've finally joined your mother, and you're probably feeling overwhelmed by what I've left behind. I know this comes as a shock. I know you're angry with me for keeping secrets, but I need you to understand that everything I did was to give you a choice I never had, the choice to live a life of meaning instead of just success." Emma's hands trembled as she continued reading. The letter outlined her father's vision for the Foundation's future, his hopes for expanding conservation efforts worldwide, and his absolute faith that Emma would find a way to balance her children's needs with the sanctuary's mission. "The lions aren't pets, Emma," the letter continued. "They're promises. Promises to a world that's forgetting how to coexist with creatures that have as much right to this planet as we do. King isn't just a lion. He's a symbol of everything broken that can still be healed. Don't abandon him, don't abandon them, and don't abandon the part of yourself that brought you home when I was dying." Patricia Martinez cleared her throat gently. "There's something else you need to know. Your father's will contains a rather unusual provision regarding a man named Richard Blackstone. He's been trying to purchase the sanctuary property for the past 2 years, offering increasingly aggressive terms. Your father refused every offer, but he's also named Mr. Blackstone as a co-trustee of the foundation." Emma looked up sharply. "A co-trustee? Why would Dad trust a stranger with his foundation?" "According to these documents, Mr. Blackstone isn't exactly a stranger. Your father believed him to be the son of his best friend from Korea, Sergeant Tommy Thompson. There are notes here suggesting your father spent decades trying to locate this person." Before Emma could process this information fully, her phone rang. Dr. O'Connor's name appeared on the screen, and Emma answered with growing dread. "Maggie, what's wrong?" "Emma, you need to get back here immediately. King hasn't moved from the spot where he could see your father's bed through the window. He's not eating, not drinking, not responding to any stimuli. And there's something else. There are demolition crews setting up at the front gate. Someone's trying to shut us down." Emma felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive from Austin to the sanctuary gave Emma time to think about the impossible situation she'd inherited. 3 weeks ago, her biggest concern had been closing the Yamamoto deal and fighting her ex-husband for custody of their children. Now she was responsible for a global conservation empire, 23 grieving lions, and a legacy that felt too large for any one person to handle. The scene at the sanctuary gates confirmed her worst fears. 3 bulldozers sat idling in the parking area, accompanied by a fleet of trucks carrying demolition equipment. A team of workers in hard hats was surveying the property with clipboards and measuring devices, while a man in an expensive suit supervised the operation with military precision. Emma parked her rental car and marched toward the man in the suit, her lawyer instincts kicking in with full force. "Excuse me, but this is private property. You need to leave immediately." The man turned, and Emma was struck by his sharp features and prematurely gray hair. Despite being maybe 50 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and wealth. "Ms. Henderson Walsh, I presume?" "Richard Blackstone, Blackstone Development Corporation." He extended a hand that Emma pointedly ignored. I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm afraid your father's death doesn't change our legal position. We have permits to demolish these structures and begin development of the Austin Hills Resort Complex. The hell you do, Emma shot back, falling into the aggressive tone that had made her reputation in San Francisco courtrooms. This property belongs to the Henderson Foundation, and I'm the sole trustee. Any permits you think you have are worthless without the Foundation's consent. Blackstone's smile was coldly professional. Actually, according to Texas property law and your father's somewhat unconventional financial arrangements, the situation is more complicated than you realize. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. Emma felt her temper rising. There's nothing to discuss. This sanctuary is not for sale, and it's not being demolished. These animals have lived here for years. This is their home. Ms. Henderson Walsh, I understand you're emotional about your father's passing, but sentiment doesn't pay property taxes or maintenance costs. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain a facility like this? Your father was spending nearly $2 million annually just on basic operations. Money that he could afford, Emma replied, though she was beginning to understand that her father's financial empire came with complexities she'd never considered. Blackstone's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been surprise. Your father never told you, did he? About the loans, the leveraged assets, the financial juggling he was doing to keep this place operational? Emma felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, but she refused to show weakness in front of this man who clearly viewed her as an obstacle to be removed. Whatever my father's arrangements were, they're my responsibility now, and I'm telling you to get your equipment off this property before I call the sheriff. Sheriff's department won't help you, Blackstone said, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. I have a court order signed yesterday morning. Your father defaulted on a construction loan 18 months ago. The property reverts to my company if the loan isn't satisfied within 30 days of his death. Emma snatched the document and scanned it quickly, her legal training allowing her to cut through the bureaucratic language to the essential facts. Frank Henderson had indeed borrowed $12 million from Blackstone Development, using the sanctuary property as collateral. The loan terms were harsh but legal, and the default provisions were ironclad. $12 million, Emma said, more to herself than to Blackstone. He borrowed $12 million and used this place as collateral. Your father was a proud man who made some poor financial decisions in his final years. This doesn't have to be adversarial, Ms. Henderson Walsh. My company is prepared to offer you fair market value for the animals. We'll ensure they're relocated to appropriate facilities. Emma looked past Blackstone toward the sanctuary, where she could see King still lying in the same spot where he'd maintained his vigil since Frank's death. The other lions were scattered throughout their enclosures, but their usual activity was muted, as if they too understood that their world was under threat. What kind of appropriate facilities? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Zoos, mostly. There are several excellent facilities in Texas that have expressed interest. The San Antonio Zoo has agreed to take 6 of them, and we've had inquiries from facilities in Houston and Dallas as well. Emma felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. She thought about her father's words about zoos being prisons, even the good ones. She thought about King, who had learned to trust humans again after being abandoned as a cub, facing another abandonment and relocation to a concrete enclosure where tourists would stare at him through glass barriers. And if I can't pay the loan? Blackstone's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. Then we proceed with development as planned. The resort will bring jobs and tax revenue to the area. Progress, Ms. Henderson Walsh. Sometimes progress requires difficult choices. Emma folded the court order and put it in her purse, her mind already working through legal strategies and financial options. Mr. Blackstone, you said my father named you as a co-trustee of his foundation. That seems like an odd choice if you've been trying to destroy his life's work. For the first time since the conversation began, Blackstone's confident demeanor faltered slightly. Your father was a complicated man with some unusual ideas about redemption and forgiveness. Redemption for what? Blackstone was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's face as if trying to decide how much to reveal. That's a conversation for another time, Ms. Henderson Walsh. Right now, you have 27 days to come up with $12 million plus accrued interest. The clock is ticking. As Blackstone and his crew packed up their equipment and left, Emma walked through the sanctuary grounds, seeing them with new eyes. Every fence, every building, every piece of equipment represented thousands of dollars her father had invested in creating a home for animals that had nowhere else to go. The financial pressure he must have felt, the desperate measures he'd taken to keep this place operational, it explained so much about his final years. Dr. O'Connor found Emma sitting on a bench near King's enclosure, staring at the magnificent lion who had somehow become the symbol of everything her father had tried to protect. "Emma, I heard voices at the gate. Is everything okay?" Emma showed Maggie the court order, watching the veterinarian's face go pale as she read the legal language. $12 million, Maggie whispered. Frank never told me he was borrowing money to keep us operational. He didn't tell anyone, apparently. Maggie, if I can't find a way to pay this loan, King and all the others are going to be shipped off to zoos. Everything Dad built here dies with him. King raised his massive head at the sound of Emma's voice, his golden eyes meeting hers through the fence. In that moment, Emma understood what her father had meant about promises. King wasn't just looking at her, he was trusting her, the way he'd learned to trust Frank after being abandoned and injured as a cub. Emma made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life forever. Maggie, I need you to call an emergency board meeting of the Henderson Foundation, and I need you to help me understand exactly what it takes to run this place. Emma, are you sure about this? You have children in California, a career, a life. I have a family here too, Emma interrupted, looking at King, and Henderson women don't abandon family. Emma Henderson Walsh stood at her father's graveside 5 months later, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from the sanctuary grounds that morning. The November air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the Texas sky stretched endlessly blue above the modest cemetery where Frank Henderson lay buried beside his wife Sarah. The headstone was simple granite, exactly as he'd requested, bearing only his name, dates, and the inscription, "He kept his promises." The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy the sanctuary had been resolved through a combination of foundation assets, emergency fundraising, and an unexpected partnership that still amazed Emma when she thought about it. Richard Blackstone, who had revealed his true identity as Michael Thompson, son of Frank's Korean War buddy, had not only forgiven the $12 million debt, but had converted his development company into a conservation-focused enterprise. The Austin Hills Resort had been redesigned as an ecotourism facility that brought visitors to observe and learn about wildlife rehabilitation. "I brought you something, Dad," Emma said softly, placing the flowers at the base of the headstone. Jake's report card, straight A's this semester, and his essay about wildlife conservation won first place in the state competition. Sophie's doing well, too. She's decided she wants to be a veterinarian like Dr. Maggie. Emma had made the difficult decision to relocate her children from San Francisco to Texas permanently, a choice that had initially met with resistance from both kids and her ex-husband. But Jake and Sophie had adapted to their new life with the resilience of youth, finding wonder in their daily proximity to lions and other rescued animals. The custody battle that had once consumed Emma's life had evolved into a cooperative co-parenting arrangement when her ex-husband saw how happy and grounded the children had become. "King's doing well," Emma continued, settling onto the stone bench that had been placed near the grave. He's learned to trust me, though I know I'll never replace you in his heart. We've got 3 new cubs at the sanctuary, rescues from a private owner in Oklahoma who couldn't care for them properly. King's taken them under his wing, teaching them things I couldn't begin to understand. The transformation in King over the past 5 months had been remarkable to witness. After Frank's death, the lion had gone through a grieving process that Dr. O'Connor documented for a veterinary journal article about animal mourning behaviors. For weeks, King had maintained his vigil at the spot where he could see Frank's hospital bed through the window, refusing food and showing signs of depression that worried everyone at the sanctuary. The breakthrough had come when Emma made the decision to move into her father's mobile home permanently, bringing Jake and Sophie with her from California. King seemed to understand that Emma represented continuity, a connection to Frank that meant the sanctuary would continue operating as a family rather than just a business. He began eating again, interacting with the other lions, and gradually accepting Emma as his new primary human companion. "Michael stopped by yesterday," Emma said, using the name Richard Blackstone had asked to be called once his true identity was revealed. "He brought plans for the new education center. Did you know he's been searching for you for 50 years, Dad? He thought you'd abandoned him after his father died, but he was wrong. You never stopped looking for him either." The reconciliation between Emma and Michael Thompson had been one of the most unexpected developments in the months following Frank's death. When Michael revealed his true identity and the decades of anger he'd carried toward Frank, Emma had shown him the contents of her father's private office. Filing cabinets full of private investigator reports, newspaper clippings tracking Michael's business success, and letters Frank had written but never sent to the boy he'd promised to care for after Tommy Thompson's death in Korea. "Your father spent nearly $2 million over 5 decades trying to find me," Michael had told Emma during one of their planning sessions for the sanctuary's expansion. "Every PI report, every false lead, every dead end, he documented it all. He never gave up, Emma. He just never found the right trail." The irony that Michael had been trying to destroy the very thing Frank had built as penance for failing to find him wasn't lost on either of them. Michael's guilt over his misdirected revenge had motivated him to channel his considerable business acumen into making the sanctuary not just sustainable, but thriving. "The foundation is doing well, Dad," Emma reported to the headstone. "We've established 3 new sanctuaries this year, one in Montana, one in North Carolina, and we're breaking ground on a facility in Costa Rica next spring. Michael's handling the business side, Doctor. Maggie oversees all medical operations, and I'm learning to manage the daily operations here at home." Emma's legal background had proven invaluable in navigating the complex regulations surrounding wildlife rehabilitation and the international aspects of the Foundation's work. She'd taken leave from her San Francisco law firm initially, then formally resigned when it became clear that her new life in Texas was not temporary, but permanent. The financial revelation about her father's wealth had initially overwhelmed Emma, but she'd gradually learned to view the money as a tool rather than a burden. The Henderson Foundation now employed 47 people across its various facilities, contributed millions annually to wildlife research and habitat preservation, and had become a model for private conservation efforts worldwide. "King's still waiting for you, you know," Emma said, her voice growing thick with emotion. "Every morning he positions himself at the gate at exactly the time you used to arrive for work. Doctor, Maggie says it's become part of his routine, a way of honoring your memory. I think he's teaching the younger lions about loyalty." The relationship between Emma and King had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared grief for the man they'd both loved. King had never shown Emma the same immediate trust he'd given Frank, but over months of patient interaction, he'd come to accept her presence and even seek out her company during his daily routines. Emma reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a worn leather journal. Frank's daily log of sanctuary operations that she'd been reading to better understand her father's methods and philosophy. "I've been reading your notes, Dad. Every entry, every observation about the animals, every financial decision you made. I'm starting to understand what you meant about love being something you do, not something you say." The journal entries had revealed the depth of Frank's emotional connection to each animal under his care. He documented not just medical treatments and feeding schedules, but personality quirks, behavioral changes, and his own emotional responses to the animal's progress or setbacks. Reading his words, Emma had finally understood that the sanctuary wasn't just her father's penance for a wartime killing, it was his expression of love for creatures that had no other advocate. "Jake asked me yesterday if you're proud of what we're doing with the sanctuary," Emma continued. "I told him you would be, but the truth is I hope we're doing right by your vision. This life is so different from what I thought I wanted, Dad. But it's also more meaningful than anything I ever accomplished in a courtroom." Emma's children had embraced their new life with enthusiasm that sometimes amazed their mother. Jake, now 13, had become fascinated with animal behavior and spent hours observing the lions while sketching their interactions in notebooks he carried everywhere. Sophie, 11, had attached herself to Dr. O'Connor and was already talking about veterinary school with the certainty of someone who'd found her calling early. "Sophie said something interesting last week," Emma told the headstone. "She said she thinks you sent King to teach us about family, about how love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes shape. Pretty wise for an 11-year-old, don't you think?" The sound of approaching footsteps made Emma turn. Michael Thompson walked across the cemetery grounds, carrying a small wreath made from pine boughs and winter berries. At 51, he'd changed considerably from the angry businessman who'd threatened to demolish the sanctuary 6 months ago. His gray hair had grown longer, his expensive suits had been replaced by practical work clothes, and his face carried the peace of someone who'd finally found his purpose. "I hope I'm not intruding," Michael said quietly. "I wanted to bring this before the funeral this afternoon." "You're not intruding," Emma assured him. "Dad would want you here." He spent 50 years hoping for this moment. Michael knelt and placed the wreath beside Emma's wildflowers. "I've been thinking about what Tommy would say if he could see us now. His best friend's daughter and his son working together to save animals instead of destroying each other over misunderstandings and old hurts. He'd say it took us long enough to figure it out," Emma replied with a sad smile. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd found family in the most unexpected circumstances. Emma checked her watch and realized it was nearly time to return to the sanctuary. In 2 hours, visitors would begin arriving for Frank Henderson's memorial service. Not the small family funeral they'd held months ago, but a celebration of his life and work that would bring together conservationists, veterinarians, former military colleagues, and hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the animals he'd saved. "Michael, there's something I need to ask you," Emma said as they walked back toward their cars. "King has been acting differently the past few days. More restless, more vocal. Dr. Maggie thinks he senses something changing. Do you think animals can understand ceremony? Do you think he knows we're having a memorial for Dad today?" Michael considered the question seriously. "I think King understands more than we give him credit for. Your father used to tell me that lions have long memories, especially for people who've shown them kindness. Maybe King knows that today is about honoring Frank, about making sure he's remembered properly." As they drove back to the sanctuary, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her from a conference room in San Francisco to a memorial service for her father in the Texas Hill Country. The life she'd built here bore no resemblance to the one she'd planned, but it felt authentic in ways her previous existence never had. The sanctuary gates came into view, and Emma could see the early arrivals already gathering in the main courtyard. News crews were setting up equipment, distinguished guests were being escorted to their seats, and the staff was making final preparations for what promised to be a celebration worthy of Frank Henderson's legacy. But Emma's attention was drawn to King, who stood at his usual morning post by the gate, his magnificent mane catching the afternoon sunlight. As her car approached, the lion lifted his head and released a sound that made everyone in the courtyard stop what they were doing. Not quite a roar, but something deeper and more resonant, like a song of greeting that carried across the Texas landscape. "He knows," Emma whispered to herself. "Somehow he knows today is special." The memorial service was about to begin, and Emma Henderson Walsh was ready to honor her father's memory while stepping fully into the life he'd prepared her to live. Message for American seniors, 200 words. Dear friends, Frank Henderson's story isn't just about a man and his lion. It's about the dreams we postpone, the love we struggle to express, and the legacy we fear we'll never leave behind. At 78, Frank discovered that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts but in the lives we touch and the promises we keep. How many of us have spent decades building careers while our relationships gathered dust? How many conversations did we delay, thinking we had endless time? Frank lived modestly while secretly funding a global conservation empire, proving that purpose doesn't require publicity. It requires persistence. His daughter Emma learned that success without meaning is just expensive emptiness, and that sometimes our greatest calling comes disguised as our greatest loss. King the Lion showed us that loyalty transcends species, that love doesn't end with death, and that the bonds we forge with open hearts create legacies that outlast any material achievement. As we face our own mortality, Frank's story reminds us, it's never too late to choose meaning over money, connection over convenience, and love over fear. The question isn't whether we have time left, it's whether we'll use that time to build something beautiful. Discussion questions. What dream or passion have you put on hold that you could still pursue today? If you could leave one meaningful legacy like Frank's sanctuary, what would it be? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their purpose. The memorial service for Frank Henderson began at 2:47 p.m. on November 15, 2023, exactly 6 months to the minute after his death. Emma stood at the podium that had been erected in the sanctuary's main courtyard, looking out at an assembly that would have amazed and humbled her father. 374 people had gathered to honor the man who'd lived like a pauper and died like a king, representing every facet of the secret empire he'd built through decades of quiet dedication. In the front row sat Frank's old army buddies, men in their 80s who'd traveled from across the country to salute their fallen comrade. Behind them were representatives from all 47 sanctuaries in the Henderson Foundation network, veterinarians and conservationists who'd benefited from Frank's anonymous funding, and local community members who'd known him simply as the kind old man who lived with the lions. Emma's children flanked her at the podium. Jake, now 13 and tall for his age, held a folder containing the essay about his grandfather that had won the state wildlife conservation competition. Sophie, 11 and wise beyond her years, carried a wreath made from flowers grown in the sanctuary's memorial garden, each bloom representing one of the animals Frank had saved during his lifetime. 6 months ago, I thought I knew my father, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd thanks to the professional sound system Michael Thompson had donated for the occasion. Frank Henderson was a man of few words, stern discipline, and unwavering routine. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, lived in a mobile home, and complained about the cost of groceries. What I didn't know was that this seemingly simple man had quietly assembled one of the world's most comprehensive private wildlife conservation networks. Emma paused, looking toward King's enclosure where the magnificent lion stood at attention as if he understood the solemnity of the moment. But today isn't just about revealing my father's financial legacy. It's about understanding the deeper truth of who Frank Henderson really was, a man who spent 71 years carrying the weight of a single moment of violence and who dedicated the rest of his life to proving that broken things can heal, that abandoned creatures can learn to trust again, and that love doesn't always speak in words we recognize. Dr. Margaret O'Connor rose to speak next, her voice steady despite the emotion that had overwhelmed her during the service planning. I met Frank Henderson 8 years ago when I was running from my own grief, convinced that caring too much only led to heartbreak. Frank taught me that the opposite was true, that caring too little was the real tragedy. He showed me that healing others can heal ourselves, and that sometimes the family we need isn't the one we're born into, but the one we choose to create. Maggie gestured toward the lions, who had gathered near the fence as if drawn by the unusual activity in their territory. These animals weren't just Frank's responsibility. They were his congregation, his therapy, his proof that redemption was possible. Every lion that learned to trust humans again was evidence that Frank Henderson had earned his own forgiveness for whatever shadows haunted his past. Michael Thompson approached the podium with the careful dignity of a man still learning to carry his newfound peace. At 51, he looked younger than he had 6 months ago, as if discovering his true identity had lifted decades of accumulated bitterness from his shoulders. I stand before you today as living proof of Frank Henderson's persistence and faith, Michael began. For 50 years, I believed Frank had abandoned me after my father died in Korea. For 50 years, Frank spent his fortune searching for the boy he'd promised to protect. We were both wrong, and we were both right. Frank never stopped looking for me, and I never stopped needing him to find me. Michael's voice grew stronger as he continued. Frank Henderson saved more than animals. He saved people. He saved me from a lifetime of misdirected anger. He saved his daughter from a life of hollow success. He saved everyone in this audience by proving that it's never too late to choose love over fear, purpose over profit, and connection over convenience. The crowd stirred as a commotion began near King's enclosure. The massive lion had begun pacing with unusual agitation, releasing low vocalizations that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Dr. O'Connor started toward the fence, concerned about King's behavior, but Emma held up a hand to stop her. "It's okay," Emma said, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt so confident. "He's not agitated. He's anticipating something." As if responding to Emma's words, King approached the section of fence closest to the memorial service and positioned himself in perfect view of the gathered crowd. The other lions followed, creating an unprecedented assembly that had never been documented in the sanctuary's history. 23 lions arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, their attention focused not on the crowd, but on something beyond the fence line. Emma followed their gaze and gasped. Walking slowly across the field behind the sanctuary came a procession of wildlife that defied explanation. Deer, rabbits, hawks circling overhead, even a family of wild turkeys moving in formation. It was as if every wild creature in the Texas Hill Country had come to pay respects to the man who'd dedicated his life to their protection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder, "I think my father is receiving the tribute he would have valued most, acknowledgement from the creatures he spent his life protecting." Jake stepped forward, unfolding his prize-winning essay with hands that trembled slightly. "My grandfather Frank taught me that real strength isn't about being tough or hiding your feelings," the 13-year-old read in a clear voice that carried his grandfather's Texas accent. "Real strength is about keeping promises even when they're hard to keep, caring for creatures that can't care for themselves, and building something bigger than your own life. Jake looked up from his paper, making eye contact with King through the fence. Grandpa Frank promised a dying lioness in Korea that he would protect her kind. He kept that promise for 71 years. He promised King that he would never be abandoned again. Even though Grandpa can't keep that promise himself anymore, our family will keep it for him. Sophie stepped forward with her wreath, but instead of placing it near the podium, she walked directly to King's enclosure. The massive lion approached the fence and lowered his great head, allowing the 11-year-old girl to hang the flowers from the chain link directly in front of him. "King," Sophie said in a voice that somehow carried across the entire courtyard, "Grandpa Frank loved you like family. We love you like family, too. You're never going to be alone again." King's response silenced every person in the courtyard. The lion lifted his magnificent head and released 3 distinct vocalizations, sounds that those who'd known Frank best immediately recognized as mimicking his voice patterns. The first sound matched Frank's deep morning greeting to the lions. The second replicated his gentler tone when calling Emma's name. The third was something entirely new, a sound of contentment mixed with farewell that seemed to acknowledge both loss and continuity. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she understood what King was communicating. "He's saying goodbye to Dad," she whispered, "and hello to us." The memorial service concluded with a moment of silence that stretched for exactly 71 seconds, one for each year of Frank Henderson's life after Korea. During those seconds, the assembled crowd witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. King and his pride positioned themselves in perfect formation facing the crowd, as if offering their own salute to the man who'd saved them. As the crowd began to disperse, Emma remained at the podium with her children, watching King settle into his evening routine. The lion had resumed his customary position near the gate, but his posture was different now. Less vigilant waiting, more peaceful watching. "Mom," Sophie said quietly, "do you think Grandpa Frank knows how today went?" Emma looked at her daughter, then at King, then at the sanctuary that had become their home and their mission. "I think he knows, sweetheart. I think he's proud of all of us. Even King." Michael Thompson approached the family as the last visitors departed. "Emma, I wanted you to know. The memorial service raised over $2 million in donations. People were inspired by Frank's story, and they want to be part of continuing his work." "Dad would be amazed," Emma replied. "All those years of working in secret, and in the end, his story touched more people than he ever imagined possible." As the Texas sun began to set over the hill country, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched King's magnificent mane, Emma Henderson Walsh understood that her father's greatest gift hadn't been the financial empire he'd left behind. It had been the lesson that love comes in many forms. Sometimes it roars, sometimes it whispers, sometimes it simply shows up when you need it most with 4 paws and a grateful heart. The Henderson Foundation would continue growing, the sanctuary would expand its mission, and King would live out his days surrounded by family, both human and feline. Frank Henderson's promise to that dying lioness in Korea had been kept, and his legacy would continue through the lives he'd saved and the people he'd inspired to save others. In the gathering darkness, King released one final gentle rumble, not a roar of grief, but a purr of contentment. He was home and he was loved, and that was exactly what Frank Henderson had promised him 8 years ago. The promise had been kept.